the letters that Paul wrote, the Apostle Paul, specifically while he was imprisoned in Rome from 61 to 63 AD, it was believed. The letters are the letters to Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Philemon. Now, these 4 letters were written, and the uniqueness of Philemon is it was the only one that was not addressed to a church itself. It was just addressed to the individual, a person named Philemon. Now, the uniqueness of this is that Philemon wasn't some remote missionary in a church somewhere far away, or that hadn't planted a church yet, and Paul was trying to give him encouragement. No, Philemon was a member of the church in Colossae. So the letter to Colossians also addresses issues that Philemon would have been dealing with at the time as a church in a whole. Instead, Paul wrote specifically to Philemon because Paul had a specific request for Philemon. And his request had to do with a runaway slave that Philemon had. Philemon had this slave who was believed to have stolen money from him and then ran away. The slave was named Onesimus. Onesimus ran away from Colossae after running away from Philemon, his slave master, and ended up in Rome where he met Paul, and through Paul was converted to Christianity. And Onesimus was alongside Paul for a while and helped Paul out. So this letter to Philemon was written with a specific intent. It was to plead Philemon to forgive his slave Onesimus, who had run away and ended up in Rome. Now, not only was Paul asking Philemon to forgive Onesimus for his wrongdoings, he was also asking him to elevate the way he viewed Onesimus. Instead of seeing him as a runaway slave or a forgiven slave, and now you could be my slave again because I forgive you, he asked him to elevate him, to view him not only as a slave, but to view him as a brother in Christ. And Paul had to be very careful about the way that he wrote this letter, which is what I love so much about it. Is in the other 3 letters, Paul's talking as the Apostle Paul, the Apostle of Christ, who was appointed by Christ himself to deliver this word and deliver this good news to them. It could have just come out in this letter to Philemon, no. I hold the authority that Christ has given to me, and with that authority, as the Apostle of Christ over you, I demand that you forgive Onesimus as a brother in Christ and view him as a brother in Christ. But instead, Paul took a more humble approach to this. He approached Philemon as a fellow brother. And he said, he was basically at that point forfeiting all the authority that he had for himself and elevating it to where it actually belongs, which is the authority of Christ. And Paul's saying, I'm not coming to you as an apostle of Christ to a subordinate brother of Christ. I'm coming to you brother to brother. This is what Christ would want you to do. And it's not clear in the letter, Paul was writing the letter and then was then delivered, if Philemon actually did honor this request and free Onesimus and elevate him to a brother, but it's assumed that it was honored. Now, the uniqueness of this letter is that Paul doesn't explicitly talk about Jesus' death and his resurrection as he does in the other letters. It's through his actions that he is demonstrating this fact. The implication being that through Christ, we have become partners and brothers in Christ, instead of having Christ be our master and we're slaves to Christ. Likewise, we have a partnership with Christ instead of a slave-master relationship. So that's what I really like about this letter, and that's what really stood out to me about this letter, is the way that in this letter, instead of seeing it as us being subordinates of Christ and subordinates of God, we're creations, but we are viewed as brothers in Jesus, and Jesus views us as his brother. We're the adopted brothers, so we've been adopted into the family. So it's not like we are in this slave-master relationship where we're the slaves in the house of God, but instead we're going to be adopted in, and we've been adopted in. So once we enter the glory, we're going to be entering that house as a brother and not a slave. I hope you get something out of these letters and really meditate on what it is that what Paul was trying to say in Philemon, And why, think about why it was that this one specific letter with one specific request is put in the Bible for us to meditate on and think about and get the lessons from it. I hope this video blesses you in some way. Thank you very much.